So my name is Ailish Ryan. I'm a member of the Workers' Party, and like a lot of groups, we're trying to spend a bit of time organising some online activity for people to take part in over the next couple of months, and I hope everybody's keeping well at home. So if anybody hasn't used Zoom before, on the bottom left hand side you'll see a mute button. So unless you're coming in to say something specific, you should be muted at all times. That's the most important thing, just to cut out background noise. And if you're having any trouble with technology or anything like that, or you just want to add a comment for the conversation, there's a chat box on the right hand side of the screen as well. So we're joined by Conor McCabe. Conor is, I suppose, a political economist, a researcher who's done an awful lot of work with things like the Right to Change movement, and I suppose also a lot of work on the history of the Irish economy, which is what we asked him to speak to us about here this evening. And particularly, I suppose, the way that the Irish economy has developed over the last 100 years or so since independence. And so we'll probably kick off with Conor's talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then, or maybe longer, Conor can correct me, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So as I said, if anybody's having any problems, just drop a message into the chat box there. Okay, Conor, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, cheers. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Can people hear me?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, Grant.
Yes.
Grant, yeah, cheers. So yeah, in terms of this kind of short kind of presentation here, there's two things really that I really want to kind of cover. One is that it's to look at the kind of a very, very brief kind of overview of some of the structural kind of faults in the Irish kind of economy going over decades. And then secondly, it's to tie it into what's happening kind of today. So in terms of like COVID-19 and in terms of the government's kind of response kind of so far, how I would see what they're doing now is that I see it as a kind of it's an inventory of what is socially kind of necessary, but also what they want to protect. So we'll get into that kind of later on then as well. But in terms of what we're dealing with kind of today, it really goes back. Like, I think that we're still in the phase of kind of 2008, and we're still dealing with the kind of fallout from the bank crisis. Now, for me, also, it's like these are not neutral events in terms of there's a neutral view as to what they were and what caused them and what happened. When the crash kind of first happened, there was a rake of books that came out. Here's like 3 of them. It's Finn O'Toole, Shane Ross, and like Matt Cooper. But they're kind of they kind of symbolize, or they kind of capture some of the kind of analysis or kind of theoretical kind of framework that was put forward in terms of what caused the kind of 2008 crisis. And it kind of went kind of like this: it was that there were very powerful people who were pulling all these strings, who also happened to be idiots, and they had no kind of moral core. If you read any kind of Finn O'Toole article, even today, that's pretty much his template. He uses it for almost kind of everything, be it Brexit or housing or just whatever. There's very powerful but bad people who are also stupid, and they have no morals. And the solution that is put forward is that we need to talk to the experts. So you'll hear this kind of a lot, even in terms of what's going on now, even with COVID-19. It's like, oh, well, the experts, these are the ones who we must follow. Thing is, though, that we did kind of listen to the experts kind of before, and they kind of let us down, So a lot of what was being put forward as being kind of expertise was kind of bullshit, But it carried kind of weight due to the fact that it's being said by people who are seen to have kind of carry certain kind of titles, or they have kind of certain kind of outlets in terms of like media. Also, they tend to be male and have their arms crossed. What kind of gets missed, of course, is the kind of deeper structures in kind of our society, and the Irish kind of economy. This is partly down to, how like class, or well, up until 2008, class wasn't really kind of talked about kind of anymore. Social class maybe, but not in terms of workers and bosses or kind of economic kind of class relations. Now we know also that this was a very deep thing that runs through kind of Irish history. We know this from the stuff that came out in terms of the Magdalen kind of laundries, of the industrial schools, and like really what these kind of institutions were was that these were forms of class kind of coercion, um, state state funded and like church run, but there were forms of like class kind of coercion, and quite effective ones as well. Now, whereas we don't really talk about class, or didn't until the last kind of 10 years or so, that wasn't the case when the state was being formed. Back in 1923, I mean, here's an image, and there were many of these. And here's one from the kind of Voice of Labour, and the cartoon, and the caption kind of underneath it is that, has kind of capitalist kind of politician, and that sacrifices must be made in the interests of national prosperity. It's a phrase that was used back in 2008, 2010, up to 2016, and probably will be used again after COVID-19 kind of settles down, or the crisis starts to abate kind of somewhat. We may get this kind of narrative all over again. But even in terms of that kind of the state using kind of church kind of institutions as a form of like class, like coercion, I mean, it was well known what was going on in terms of like Artane. I mean, here's a cover from kind of Workers' Voice from, I think, from 1934 that just talks about, a young boy who was beaten to death in like Artane. This case itself was brought up in the Dáil. This happened a lot. The idea that people didn't know about it is not really true. They couldn't do anything about it because the state and the church was like too powerful. But when that state was being formed, there was an economic model that was being kind of put forward, and it's very much a kind of post-colonial one. I mean, this is a graph that I did up kind of many years ago about the kind of cattle kind of production in Ireland in like in the 1920s, well, in the Free State as it was then. And what you see is that there's a very strong kind of economic, rural kind of class kind of dynamic to this kind of setup. Small farmers would raise cattle. He would then sell it on to the fatteners, who would then export it over to England live on the hoof. It was very kind of profitable for those fatteners, not so much for kind of anyone else. This was pre-independence. This was a setup that goes back to the 1830s, 1840s. And it's not changed in 1922. It's not changed at all. The Southern Irish state, it remains fully integrated into the British economy up until the 1970s, really, even in terms of its currency. So the Irish pound, it never breaks with like sterling until 1979. This had enormous kind of effects in terms of a lack of investment in the state that was needed in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as the state turned into a kind of, it's an independent state, but it's still a kind of regional economy of Britain. After World War II, this starts to change, just mainly because of the Marshall Aid funds, and Ireland needed to find dollars from kind of somewhere else. Up until this point, it was still kind of buying dollars for its balance of payment like issues from London. But with the Marshall Aid plan, it couldn't do that kind of anymore. So then Ireland needs to get exports. It needs to build up its exports outside of just exporting to Britain. It needs dollar exports. So again, these two kind of blockages in terms of kind of economic and development, the banks who wanted to stay linked with sterling, and the cattle trade that wanted to just keep on selling kind of live cattle over to Britain. They were such kind of blocks that they aren't really kind of taken on. There's kind of soundings of it, but they aren't really kind of taken on. So the idea, which starts in the 1940s, but in like modern myths, has been put down to kind of Sean Lemass and the TK kind of Whitaker, is that we will now import exporters. So then Ireland goes down kind of this model of importing industry in order to export goods that will yield dollars in terms of sales. This starts first in factories. So we see many kind of pharmaceuticals start kind of moving in the 1960s. Then there's German firms that want access to the British market. And then kind of more kind of American firms. In the 1970s, there's a shift. There's a more of a greater, kind of move towards maybe more kind of financial aspects as well. Charlie Haughey was straight in on this in terms of opening up Ireland to what was then the kind of euro dollar market. But by the 1980s, with industrial investment stagnant and had been since the kind of mid 70s, but more or less kind of stagnant in terms of net investment. There's a move towards finance. So we see this kind of second wave, which is the IFSC being kind of set up in the 1980s. And in Ireland, that was always a bit of a tax haven anyway for kind of British kind of capital, really takes off as a tax haven in the 1990s, mainly for kind of German kind of capital, and then more and more for kind of US kind of capital. So much so that back in 2005, Ireland is known, or Dublin is known as the Wild West of kind of European kind of finance. So what was happening is that Ireland is being used, as it is even now today, as a conduit for kind of washing off like tax obligations. So on paper, this is in the early kind of 2010s. This image is from Ireland has this kind of global funds kind of center of 2.5 trillion assets that are being administered in Dublin, but they're not being managed here. They're being managed either in London or in kind of New York. So in terms of what kind of Ireland's role is in all of this, Arthur Cox kind of gave us this kind of wonderful kind of image of what kind of this kind of Irish kind of financial industry does in the main. I mean, it's not every single kind of company, but in the main, it's kind of defining kind of narrative is this aspect of it, where money comes into Ireland, it's washed of its tax obligations, and then it goes back out again. It's well covered. This is an article from like 2013 from Reuters that says that many of these kind of funding vehicles that are in Dublin have no employees. They are managed from another city, often London or New York, and are based in Ireland to shrink their tax bills. Now, in order to set this up, there was a need to deregulate a lot of kind of like financial law and like oversight in Ireland. This had effects in terms of our own indigenous banks, including this one here, which is the two guys from like Anglo-Irish Bank. Now, when the kind of crash happened, we saw that there was a very strong kind of concentration of the wealth that was being kind of bailed out in across these kind of 4 or 5 banks, and this is highlighted by kind of Brendan McDonough in NAMA. He was head of NAMA. He gave evidence to the Public Accounts Committee in like 2011 that said that when NAMA, and for those who don't know like what kind of NAMA is, NAMA was it was a holding for kind of property assets that were on many kind of commercial property assets that were on the books of the 4 or 5 kind of main banks in Ireland at that time, mainly Anglo and mainly kind of Irish nationwide, but also including AIB and kind of Bank of Ireland. And what he found was that you had 190 debtors in the NAMA universe with debts of 62 billion. So what you had was 190 people with debts of 62 billion, and these are the ones that were being kind of held in NAMA, and that was really where the bailout kind of went, wasn't kind of covering their debts. Instead of making those people, put them on the dole and give them kind of 200 euros a week, we kind of bailed them out and bailed out kind of that system. Now, there's an argument made by kind of William Craig Tabb in his wonderful analysis of the New York fiscal crisis of the 1970s, where he says that real elites only enter the day-to-day operations of governments in periods of crisis. They move to the background as soon as possible after they restructure the context of decision-making in ways they find congenial. And this is what I find and what I found with the bank crisis. We were able to see an element of how power works in Ireland because it had to protect itself. It had to reveal itself. Another part of that was, of course, the corporation tax industry in Ireland as well. And what I mean by the like corporation tax industry, it's those kind of secondary firms, it's the lawyers, tax lawyers, accountants who make billions every year from kind of facilitating this like corporation tax kind of scam that Ireland is. Now, when the IMF and the Troika kind of showed up, they offered Ireland this kind of option of, if you higher your corporation tax rate, that might be a way of lessening the austerity kind of measures. And what the Irish state said is, no, we'll take more austerity, but we'll keep this going. Yeah, we'll keep this kind of corporation tax kind of gig going. So when I set out to kind of write my kind of books and like analysis of this kind of situation, which is, okay, at one level it's about like the Irish kind of economy, but for me it's really about class power and how class power is rooted in kind of institutions, not just kind of people. I rejected, of course, this kind of morals, bad people. They are bad people. I'm not saying that they're not, but there's more going on than this. So for me, when I started to kind of find more conceptual kind of frameworks as to make sense of the Irish story, up to now, I started looking at these type of writers here, well, some of them anyway. And like where you find, of course, is that there's a much more stronger kind of analysis of kind of capitalism and what kind of capitalism is. So what kind of capitalism sets itself up as is that this is the kind of self-image it has, is of people sitting around offices, not anymore. Just everyone's on Zoom now, but they're all kind of high-fiving each other, and they've got beards and they drink coffee and they dream big. But really what kind of capitalism does is this. It's a machine for turning human energy, human labor, and kind of, and the environment into a kind of money form. And that's kind of what it does. And Ireland plays a role in that. So its role internationally is in terms of kind of, it's facilitating tax evasion, it's facilitating offshoring of like assets. That's its kind of niche role that it's kind of carved out for itself since the kind of 1980s. Holland has done the same. But Ireland, has really kind of run with this, and it sticks out more in Ireland because we don't have much to kind of balance it up against. But even that I found was probably kind of not enough, because of the research I was doing, of the social kind of dynamics I was finding, I still needed more to try and make sense of this world. So needed to kind of look out of the usual kind of white male capitalist, well, kind of, a white male kind of analysis of kind of capitalism. And where I found it was in kind of feminist kind of economics. And it really started, there were kind of like Maria Myers and her book, The Subsistence Perspective. And then you move on to these kind of writers here as well, which I would recommend just to anyone who's like listening or like watching this. It's just really interesting, really kind of fascinating stuff. I'll go into why I think that feminist economics and kind of ecofeminism plays a role, not only in terms of solutions, but in terms of actually making sense of the situation we're in now, even in terms of like COVID-19. I won't have time to delve into intersectionality, which has such a bad name, but really, like, it's a really strong tool in terms of kind of bringing in both race, gender, and class, which is what we kind of should do. But I'm going to try. I won't go into it in depth here. It's mainly kind of focusing in more on this kind of feminist kind of economics kind of analysis here, where women and what's seen now as being kind of gendered work has been written out of how modern kind of macroeconomics makes sense of the world. When we look at this kind of image here from J.K. Ella Gibson kind of Graham, he gives, or she gives this kind of view of what they do, of what kind of feminist economics means by this. Mainly what kind of modern kind of macro, economics in the main, and obviously it's a very short talk, so I have to oversimplify here. But like in the main, it talks about this part here. This is your kind of GDP. It's wage labor making products, be it services or actual kind of products, in a market for a kind of capitalist firm. But then there's all these other kind of aspects here, which are either kind of downgraded, they are semi kind of monetized, but a lot of them are actually done in terms of kind of non-payment, it's unpaid kind of labor. In the election we just had, one of the reasons I think why economists are Irish economists, Irish kind of commentators missed out on the vote that did happen, which was as close to a class lines kind of vote that we ever had just in the South, certainly since kind of 1932, was that they missed out on all of this stuff here. This is actually what the election became about: health, care work, housing. This is what it actually kind of came about. The crisis in like these areas is what drove a lot of that vote. So for me, when we look at how the Irish kind of economy works, how things work, we need to also look at how it actually kind of works, how actually kind of what are the kind of dynamics and the tensions that are there in terms of things like gendered work, because these things are have a huge effect in terms of kind of votes, in terms of the narrative that has been kind of put forward. There's a really handy kind of pamphlet kind of manifesto that came out kind of last year called Feminism for the 99%, and they really kind of capture this argument as to why we should have a very strong kind of Marxist feminist view of kind of capitalism, for these reasons, as it points out here. So they say that as feminists, we appreciate that capitalism is not just an economic system, but it was something larger. It's an institutionalized social order that also encompasses the apparently non-economic relations and practices that sustain the official economy. We can see glimpses of this kind of realization of how important these are with COVID-19. Like the elements that are actually keeping this state going are the ones that have been kind of belittled for decades in terms of like analysis. What I want to say is that behind kind of capitalism's official type of institutions, its wage, labor, its production, exchange, and finance stand their necessary kind of supports and enabling kind of conditions. So you have families, communities, nature, territorial states, the political organizations and civil societies, and not least of all, massive amounts and multiple forms of unwaged and expropriated kind of labor, including much of the work of social reproduction, still performed largely by women and often uncompensated. These two are constitutive elements of capitalist society and sites of struggle there in it. And this part for me is where it gets into the kind of, as you move into the final part of this kind of short talk, which is about kind of solutions, how do we organize, how do we do things? it's these largely seemingly non-economic, unwaged kind of elements that are actually where the real struggle against kind of capitalism is in these days. It's not just kind of factories. It's not just, you know, in terms of products. It's also in terms of the gendered work that is out there as well. Um, so while capitalism strives systemically to increase profits, working class people strive conversely, you know, to lead decent and like meaningful lives as social beings. These are fundamentally irreconcilable goals for kind of capitalist share of accumulation can only increase at the expense of our share in the life of like society. So working people don't just struggle for the wage, they struggle you know, for wage because they want bread and butter. This desire for kind of sustenance is the determinant, not the consequence. Thus, struggles over food, housing, water, healthcare, or education are not always expressed through the the mediated form of the wage. And that is to say, as demands for higher wages, they were in the workplace. So part of how this kind of, what I'm trying to kind of set up here is that when we look into organizational forms in terms of like of kind of resistance, we can't just use kind of trade unions. We can't just say we'll organize everyone into a trade union and then that'll be it, or we'll have everyone vote for a party and then that is it. Because struggles are not only kind of mediated through the workplace and or kind of political parties votes, every 5 years. So in order to kind of grapple with these kind of struggles, we need also other forms of kind of civic society kind of, you know, organization as well. As you move away from this view of how the economy works, where you have finance, a capital, industrial capital, and workers fighting over how much of the share of the national income goes to which is kind of, you know, which is a kind of a GDP view of how things work. That when we start bringing in kind of more kind of feminist economics kind of views of things and eco-feminist kind of views, we start to see kind of this kind of view of things. So it then moves into struggles in terms of social reproduction, in terms of global capitalism, and kind of post-colonial and kind of neo kind of colonial kind of struggles, and also in terms of the environment as well. So we've seen elements of this even since kind of 2010. Here in Ireland, I mean, the most kind of dramatic was it was kind of right to water, but we're also seeing it in terms of care work. So these are just strikes. These are sites of struggle, not just in terms of the rights of those workers, which obviously is hugely kind of important, but they're also kind of societal kind of struggles. As kind of capitalism has moved into kind of social reproduction and like care work as a profit-seeking activity, these are genuine sites of struggle, anti-capitalist kind of struggles as well. They have that kind of potential. This ties into one as well in terms of housing. The big change since kind of 2010 in terms of the housing market has, of course, been the corporate landlords who've been moving in. So we have these on the rise, and these are now kind of price setters, or were until kind of 4 weeks ago, in terms of like housing. There's a move internationally for kind of capital to move into housing kind of rental instead of just kind of mortgages. They kind of got their fingers burnt with the mortgages, and now they're thinking, well, if we own the houses and rent them out, that's a much safer kind of model for their own kind of profit-seeking like strategies. Now, these tied in some, you know, in a uneven way, but these did tie into the general kind of election that happened less than 2 months ago, but it seems like years ago. And we saw elements of that. That whereas the kind of commentariat wanted the election to be about one thing, the voters had another view, and they voted it in terms of care, in terms of housing, in terms of like health. These haven't been stalled. These issues have not kind of gone away. But what we have seen now, of course, is COVID-19 and the government's kind of response to this, which has been, in the main, still kind of framed by the same kind of thinking, the same kind of neoliberal, free market kind of view of how things should work, even in terms of this. And if we saw in like 2008 some of the stronger kind of elements of like Irish capital, we can see this here today in terms of COVID-19, that some of the elements that are not being kind of that really were kind of have been kind of left alone, and these are costing lives, has been kind of the privatization of like nursing homes in the last kind of 10-15 years, the construction sector that only last week was forced to start kind of shutting down sites, in terms of like landlords that at a structural level have not been touched in any way in any of the government's kind of measures. Banking is the same. Any of the schemes, in fact, all the schemes that I've seen that have been put in place to so-called help kind of businesses, I really have been set up with a very strong profit-seeking element for banks as well. Loans of up to 7.8% being charged their businesses to try and tie them over as they pay their kind of commercial kind of landlords. For funds which the Irish government has guaranteed, which leads me to believe that this is ECB money, which they get for free. It does so. Why we have any kind of loans that are kind of interest bearing, who knows? And then of course, kind of the absolute horror and the new industrial schools scandal of direct provision, which is a system that was set up purely to monetize refugees, how to monetize them, and that's how they've done it. These elements in the last kind of 4 or 5 weeks structurally have not been touched. It's incredible how like nursing homes weren't kind of nationalized or like taken over day one. We know that like COVID-19, it's a virus that disproportionately attacks older people. Your front line is going to be nursing homes. Now it's coming out slowly. It's like even the HSE can't hide these scandals anymore in terms of the clusters. But they didn't want and don't want to change that privatization kind of model. Same as with kind of landlords as well. So what do we do about it? So in terms of like going forward, and as with anything, how with any kind of crisis, you can go for a managerial kind of view of how to deal with it, which is in the main how the main political parties, even the like progressive ones, have done. There's none of the parties, like Sinn Féin, the Greens, Soc Dems, who did well in the last election. There's none of them who actually kind of put forward with any kind of structural changes, who have actually said, this crisis shows that we need genuine structural change in terms of how kind of profit-seeking activities work on this island. That hasn't happened. So we could go down that road, have some effects, but we'll be back here again in like 10 years' time, or we can move into something that is more kind of transformative. And again, a book I found kind of interesting or kind of helpful because she really kind of, again, encapsulates kind of these arguments. It's the one by Hilary kind of Wainwright, who talks about power is the capacity to bring about change, and the occupation of the institutions, and I'll come to that in the next slide, is only one part of what makes change possible. The power to act comes from a combination of occupying both the institutions and the squares in what she calls a permanent, like, creative kind of tension. So what she means by the march through kind of institutions is that she's talking about, in broad terms, the institutions of the left, which in most countries are the trade union movement and the political party stroke movement that, you know, as well. These are the two broad kind of left institutions. So it's like trade unions and its parties. So one way of having that change is to somehow work your way into these two elements, take them over, and then have change in that way. However, from a feminist kind of analysis, we know that that'll only go so far. So going back to Hillary's argument, we need both to take over these kind of institutions or have them kind of working, but also have populist kind of, kind of agitation as well. These complement each other, even if they both kind of piss off each other, which they tend to do. But it's that tension that's between the kind of grassroots, non-institutional kind of grassroots kind of left and the institutional left. Out of that tension comes, she argues, and I think she's right, change and ideas as to how to change things. So one way of seeing this is that you look towards a kind of commonwealth, which is of kind of civil society groups, it's your parties and our kind of reps, and it's also kind of trade unions. These are not people here. These are also kind of structures. So wherever those kind of non-left kind of institutional kind of structures, I would say, as being kind of civil society, they need to be kind of working together in terms of an overall view and recognizing that they are going to piss each other off, that there are going to be tensions, but actually that tension is actually fundamental to having kind of ideas and kind of strategies and like tactics. It's in that kind of conversation where real kind of dynamic kind of comes forward for what we want, which is what I would want anyway, which is a kind of eco-feminist socialist utopia. So that's me talk. Have you all left me?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry.
I can hear someone now, yeah.
Yeah, that's so good.
Hi, Conor.
Scott, how are you?
Yeah. No, good. No, so how many of us are here at the talk?
There's 17 and there's about 6 or 7 on Facebook Live as well, so about 25.
So we're able to chat now, yeah?
Yeah, work away, yeah. So there's a couple of people have unmuted themselves there. So there's Scott, Anne and Gus. So I guess, Scott, if you want to go first and ask as you wish.
Conor, what do you think? Do you think this COVID thing is the end? Because, like, Trump, if you've been watching his performances lately, although his character, he's changed last night. He's now serious and saving lives, you know. But he has been openly saying about we have to bring them home, you know, the supply chains, all this sort of stuff, you know, for the pharma companies, etc. And this looks like it's going to be one hell of a clatter to American capitalism. Do you think, well, I've been kind of saying, and I don't know, I'm overstating it, that we could end up like Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union with our economic model, because the US might be in a very bad situation after this. Do you think this COVID-19 thing could end our economic model, or do you think it will be able to regenerate itself in some way, or is it too early to say?
No, it's a good question. I mean, like, I think that there's more going on in Ireland than just the kind of tax avoidance. As we've seen there with kind of COVID, what actually keeps this country running are the hundreds of thousands of people who are doing kind of the jobs that are being kind of kept going here anyway. None of those jobs are kind of dependent on Ireland's kind of tax haven kind of industry. You know, as an industry, it implies very few people comparatively. You know, it's like tens of thousands in terms of the tax haven element of it. But it brings in enormous figures, which are obviously which are not real. But how these companies make money is by charging kind of fees for handling these, and there's millionaires in Dublin who are millionaires just on like those fees. I think it's under strain. Like, it's under strain anyway. Like Jim Stewart of like TCD, who's done kind of more work on this than almost anyone else. He's been saying just for the last kind of 6-7 years that the writing is on the wall in terms of this. Like, there's two elements to it. There's the tax haven kind of industry part of it, and then there's the actual industry. So like Apple, it's a great kind of example of it. Apple employs 4,000 or 5,000 people in Cork and like surrounding areas. But then there's Apple Holdings, which is the tax haven one, and that employs kind of nobody. The Apple Holdings could close down kind of tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect those jobs down in Cork, but it would affect those tax lawyers up in Dublin who do all the work for them. So I think it will be put under kind of severe strain, if for no other reason than what's going on in terms of like Europe now. I mean, I don't think like I don't want to get kind of like the Eurozone is at a very critical point now, and I think everyone kind of knows that now, because there's no way on the God's earth that Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece are going to allow an austerity kind of response in the aftermath of like COVID-19 as what was handed down after 2000 and after 2010. In terms of Ireland, its kind of tax haven model is going to be dented. But I think a much more serious one is, well, where's the Eurozone go now? Like, if the Eurozone can't handle this crisis, it's second in like 10 years. If it cannot handle this one in a socially just way, and really, like, it will be under severe strain. I can't see the peoples of those countries taking it again. So I think that if it's a game changer, who knows? One of the things, I'm sorry for fucking ranting on, but I'll just finish on this last point. Every single time that capitalism has been told it's the end has been wrong up to now. We know this because it's still here. So we've heard this hundreds of times, that is this the moment that's going to kill capitalism, or kill a certain way of like working. It hasn't up to now. So if we know anything about it, it's bloody kind of resilient. So really, it's about, regardless of whether it carries on or not, what's our objective and what are our kind of strategies in terms of getting our agenda forward, regardless of whether it like survives or not.
Thanks, Conor, and thanks, Scott. Anybody else want to come in there with any questions or contributions?
Conor.
Yes, yeah.
Anne Campbell, how are you?
Anne, how are you? Things
good. It's more an observation really than anything else. I read that Feminism for the 99% last year, and it changed my view of everything. It's really, really good, and I think it's free on the Kindle at the moment if anybody wants to go and get it. Yeah, but one of the things, and it's just from, I thought the talk was really, really interesting. The way you were able to bring it right from the start all the way through to now and maybe into the future. But one of the things that I did, just an observation, is that I feel the longer that this lockdown happens and the more that people are at home, people are now beginning to appreciate the work that women are doing.
Yes.
That thing that you put up with, the iceberg and all the work underneath it that never gets paid, never gets recognised, is demeaned. Men are now involved in childcare activities that they never had to do before. The society is beginning to understand what it is like for working women, for working mothers, for people who care for older parents, people who care for young children. The genie is out of the bottle now. My husband works for one of your big American tax dodging corporations, and they have a couple of thousand people here in where I live in Dundalk. They've been told for years, we can't move this operation to your home, Mrs. You can't, you have to work 5 days a week, Mrs., because we need you here. They moved probably 1,200 people to their homes within 10 days of the first announcement. My sister-in-law works for a major pharmaceutical company in Drogheda. She's pregnant again with her third child. She was told as recently as 6 months ago, you can't do more than 1 day a week at home. She's now running a whole department from her house while minding 2 children. Jesus. Conor, the genie's out of the bottle now, and I think women are going to be to the forefront of making sure that there's going to be far better work practices. If that's the only thing that I think can come out of this, I think it's a really good start, and I think it's going to be immediate, because I think there's going to be such a demand. My boss is not going to tell me 5 days a week in the office anymore. That's not going to happen anymore.
Thanks very much, Anne, for that contribution. Conor, do you want to come back in there, or is there anybody else who wants to come in at this point?
Sorry, just to say thanks very much for Conor for his talk. It's very informative, particularly for somebody like me. Can people hear me? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, thanks.
Yeah, particularly for someone like me who doesn't live in Ireland and hasn't lived there for a long time. A lot of interesting angles, but is it going to lead to a major change? It's like Conor says, capitalism has been very resilient up to now, and I would have thought we're more disjointed than before. But I don't honestly know.
Okay, I'm just going to stop recording and switch off the Facebook Live just to end the formal part of the meeting. But feel free to just continue a more informal conversation. It might be a bit easier to chat